So I think what we're going to do is we're going to move straight into the wrap-up at this point. And we've asked Rahmani, we've asked Desmond, we've asked Carl to really reflect on the last 2.5 days and to give us some indication of their thoughts about what are the most salient things to emerge over the last 2 days. What is it that we take away? What is it that we think about as we move forward? And we try to think about really building a network of scholars who are thinking very deeply about violence, not only in Africa but in Latin America, and of course in comparative ways across different contexts. So I'm going to ask, maybe Rahmani, can we start with you? I mean, I don't think we have any particular order, but can we start with you and for you to perhaps share some of your thoughts first?
Okay, thank you. Actually, Carl, when you explained to me what I was supposed to do, my brief was to kind of be the representative of the African continent. and I told Carl that this should remain a secret because I'm based in the Center for African Studies, that I'm an African, but I'm not sure I'm an Africanist, in the sense that I cannot actually give you the right information on every issue that is related to Africa. Like in this case, of course, the issue of violence, which of course is hugely debated among Africanist communities, economists, political scientists, historians, anthropologists, etc. So I'm not going to try to do that. I will try to bring us back to some of the things that were discussed during the 2 past days. And I was looking for a unifying theme for my intervention so that it can be short and to the point. And the one that I found, and that sounded to me like some kind of elephant in the room, is capitalism, the role of capitalism, the relations of capitalism and violence. I think it is one of the unifying themes, not only one, but one of the unifying but underlying themes in what we discussed about violence during these 2 days. But unfortunately, it allows us only to, I think the way I will look at capitalism will allow us to stay at kind of macro level regarding violence. And many of the research and things that we have were really at a kind of micro level. But since I'm supposed to talk about the whole continent, it's fine that I stay at a macro level. And I think capitalism was kind of mentioned a few times, even if it was never really directly addressed. And it was approaching kind of seeing it as something, in a sense, criminal, I would say, like in the case of your presentation, Desmond. I mean, those drug cartel groups are really big capitalist corporations or organizations. They have all the factors of economic sector. They have the capital, they have the labor, they have the land, they have the 3 key factors. They are acting in a very competitive environment. They are seeking to expand. They are operating on a national and international scale. So these are really capitalist organizations in that sense, but criminal capitalist organizations, openly criminal in the sense that they are also illegal. But we also have criminal capitalist organizations that are operations, at least, that are legal. I would think in the case of the mining industry in South Africa, which led to the massacre of Marikana, which we have started this colloquium. And the massacre of Marikana was really a crime. It was a very great crime. And I'm not saying that the whole mining industry is criminal, but some aspects of its operations are criminal. But this is a crime in a human and moral sense that is considered legal, because there is this is a word that Carl likes to use. I think it's a good word, disjuncture. There is a disjuncture between, I will use some French language concept, the pays réel and pays légal, the legal country, and real country. And in this sense, the real country would be the workers, the miners, the people in the rural areas, and the legal country would be the politicians, decision makers in businesses, traditional chiefs, all those people, in fact, who are saying what is legal. And the disjunctures between this legal country and this real country is a source of violence. And I think this is something that we see in pretty much all of the cases that were discussed, either in Africa or in Latin America. In my own research, I used violence as a way to look at how the center and the elite of a polity, even though in the presentation that I made, the geographic aspect was more visible than the sociological aspect, but center and elite are mutually constitutive, of course, and how they may constitute themselves at many levels in kind of violent relations with both the periphery and the masses. And I'm mentioning this center and periphery dimension because I think conceptualizations of violence can also be used to look at the centers and peripheries of the global capitalist political economy. In the case of South Africa in the case of the African continent, the regions that were talked about in this colloquium were South Africa, the Sahel, DRC, Malawi, and in a sense these are really extreme opposites, in the sense that South Africa is a part of the African continent that is most integrated in the operations of global capitalism, whereas the Sahel is the one that is least integrated, and the DRC and Malawi would fall on the Sahel side, and the DRC could be even considered that the part of the African continent that is integrated in the global capitalist economy in the most damaging way. It is, in that sense, it is really interesting to compare those regions, especially since there are many similarities. And the more I hear what you're saying, Carl, about the politics of South Africa, the more I see the similarities between what is happening in other countries in the continent. But because of this difference, in the case of South Africa and the Sahel, for instance, South Africa being closer to the center, violence seems to be, at least in the ways that we have heard about it, deeply shaped by capitalism, be it how violence is meted out to workers, how it savages the environment and the health of the populace, especially the poor, and how it can be seen to be at the origin of gangsterism. I was really amazed and fascinated by the presentation of Javier about this, but there was a point where I actually talked with him about that, but he left, unfortunately, so he's not here. And it's not actually a criticism of what he said, but it has to do with this difference that he's making between race and class. And because of my historian proclivities, I discussed with him the fact that when we speak of the difference between race and class, we tend to forget that race was the first subservient class of capitalism. When we speak of capitalism today, we think really, we refer to modern capitalism, that is financial and industrial capitalism. That goes back to the Industrial Revolution, and whose exploited labor force is industrial worker. But before in industrial capitalism, before this modern capitalism, the first globalized capitalism was mercantile capitalism, which is this trade-based, finance-supported but state-protected capitalism, mostly trade-based, and this mercantile capitalism was really deployed in what is now the global south. And it produced the first regimented labor force of capitalism before we have this industrial worker in the north. And it did it, of course, when we think of the Indonesians in the Sunda Islands, who were called into regimented labor by the Dutch trading companies, when you think of what Western Europeans did in America, first with the Native Americans, then when the Africans were imported as slaves, and Cape Town was really just a capitalist depot, which also needed this regimented slave labor organized around it. And so, in that sense, in fact, race emerged as the first social class, the first subservient social class, because all the capitalists were Europeans, who then started to define themselves as white, and the people who could benefit from the expansion of capitalism were also mostly Europeans, who started also to define themselves as white, And so labor, subservient labor, had to be defined as a race that is non-European, so non-whites. And that was what I found fascinating in his presentation, is how he showed that gangsterism can be actually an evidence of this process of what he called racialization, but which is not very different, in fact, from divergences in social classes. And now something completely different. In the Sahel, which is at the far edge of the global capitalist political economy, violence is shaped more indirectly by the operations of capitalism, really. Capitalism made of such places basically foreign factor economies in which the value produced in terms of trade or extractive resources, and I said the Sahel, but this is true, of course, for Malawi. We heard about it with the blood-sucking story, and also in the case of the DRC, it's completely there. So those foreign factor economies in which the value produced in terms of trade or extractive resources accrue to the center, and the local masses are excluded, sometimes forcibly, very visibly so in the case of DRC, but also there were instances in the case of in West Africa, in the case of the hunting reserves I mentioned, apropos Burkina Faso and Benin, for instance. So they're removed from processes of wealth creation and wealth accumulation. And I think this creates deep intimacies of violence between center and periphery, or between the global south and north, which probably or obviously have their South American version, and which I wanted to stress. Especially also since there is a clear sense in which this determines what one might call varieties of violence, in the sense in which we see, for instance, police waging war on workers who are defined as criminal in South Africa, armies waging war on peasants who are described as terrorists in the Sahel, and we have the gruesome stories told by Alice about rape in the DRC, of course, kind of play into that in other ways. And in the case of the presentation on Malawi, that was also very clear. But I don't want to, in a nutshell, that's really what I wanted to give a sense of those links between capitalism, especially global capitalism, and violence in the case of Africa.
So I've been thinking about sort of points of dialogue between the African and Latin American scholars. And I'll try to speak about this mostly from the Latin American perspective, which is inevitable because that's where I sort of come from. One thing I don't think anybody's really talked about, but that is I think a huge issue that's worth putting on the table, is the idea of persistence. Violence in all of the societies that we're talking about is extremely persistent. It's not going anywhere. It's established, it's deeply rooted, it's incredibly difficult to respond to. It's a functional part of these societies and political systems. It's not something opposed to these political systems. And I think understanding both its persistence and the way it is integrated and serves the interests and needs and feeds off the dynamics of each of these systems is really important to recognize. And until we sort of get our heads around sort of that concept of persistence, the stickiness, and the functional roles of violence in society, it's sort of impossible to think about responses. Because any sort of standard institutional response is really going to be operating on the surface. And I think the film that we saw and the work of Hema, which is historical, going back to the 19th century, and some of Hugo's work, all sort of speak to this concept of persistence. The second thing that's come up that I brought up initially, but I think that was fleshed out in some really interesting and complex ways over the course of the conference, is this idea of hybridity, right? That a lot of violence and a lot of governance, which are deeply interlinked concepts, in these contexts are working together, right? There's different institutions, different actors that are constantly interacting with each other to produce violence and to control violence, right? And to extend violence and use violence for different projects. And understanding those dynamics is very important. I think two interesting ways this got developed over the course of the conference is in terms of thinking about hybridity as dialogue, right? In terms of how different violent actors or nonviolent actors are dialoguing with each other. I think we saw a great deal of this in Nick's presentation and in Jorge's presentation, and it also came out in Obvious's presentation and Daniel's presentation later today. That these dialogues of violence, right, how conversations go about violence and how people respond to it are important. And it's also important to understand how acts of violence themselves are a basis for these violent dialogues, right? That acts of violence are often telling a story, right, that, or responding to a previous act of violence or action, such, you know, it was talked about in some of the discussion of xenophobia and migration today also. Another thing that comes up is this concept of syncretism, which came up in Lauren and JP's paper explicitly at the end of the day, but which I also was hearing in Heinrich and Thiago's paper earlier today, right? That as you have hybridities and you have these dialogues, you also have these ideas of syncretic states, of states and other violent actors working through each other, operating in different levels, and at times even pretending to be each other or speak for each other when they may or may not be doing that, right? So understanding how this hybridity works through the institutional syncretism that Lauren and JP were talking about, or through the ways in which subjectivities are established in Rios amid violence, right, in the military order that Heinrich and Thiago were talking about, I think are also important. I agree wholeheartedly with what the previous speaker just said about economies. And I think this came out in Jacinto's presentation yesterday, and I think in some ways it's important to consider how much difference there really is between licit and illicit economies, right? How much promiscuity there is between them, right? How much exchange there is between them, and what the impacts of that are for people who live in those economies. I think it's important to think about the various sources of violent economies, right? So drugs in the Americas is a huge source. It's probably a more limited source in Africa, but it's also important to think about extortion, exploitation, right? And also about theft of political budgets, right? And about how politics becomes mixed up in drawing money out and stealing money, and how violence becomes mixed up in that, especially in patronage-based conflict, which is something you see a lot of in Jamaica. One big thing that I was talking about with Nick earlier, and that I noticed also in Ocasio's presentation, is that in South Africa, violence seems to be highly contested, right? There's this sort of dialogue on the ground of violence. No one necessarily controls a neighborhood, you know, so Nick's story went to this very clearly of, you know, someone's trying to control crime and then people try and kill them, but that doesn't stop people from trying to control crime. But in most places where you have this violence in Latin America, you tend to have one dominant group, and there's no sort of dialogue of someone coming back and trying to kill the vigilante chief, right? The vigilantes are the ones who do the killing, and maybe there's a fight among the vigilante chiefs occasionally, but you really tend to have one dominant organization. Whereas in South Africa, it seems that there's a lot of violent contestation within neighborhoods. And that's, I think, an important difference that's worth reflecting on. And this sort of gets me to just two last points that I think sort of, you know, we can take further and sort of take this out of the concept of this sort of dialogue between regions. And it's like one of the big limitations here of all of this dialogue are Weberian myths, right? So we're sort of stuck in some ways when talking about violence in Latin America and in Africa with this, in many cases, this sort of Weberian notion of the state and what the state should be. And we're stuck with this myth of the state that's rooted in 20th century political theory, based in Europe, that probably didn't reflect the ways in which people were living in European political systems at the time, right? So if you think about, you know, violence in the UK or Italy or Spain or Germany during different parts of the 20th century, there's always been this sort of paramilitarism and clientelism and sort of this non-state violence, right? That state sovereignty over violence has never really been complete anywhere. But we're all sort of stuck with this expectation. And it's time to sort of turn that expectation on its head and say, look at how we're all really living, right? Look at how people lived in the American South under Jim Crow with paramilitary violence. Look at paramilitary violence in Northern Ireland, right? All of these states that are in theory the most consolidated states, the models of Weberian governance, don't have it, right? And the way people are living in the global South is much more consistent with the experience of even how people very often live in the global North, especially poor working class people in those countries and immigrants. And it's only, I think, by turning this on its head that we can sort of move forward and have a more constructive discussion, not only informing how to develop policy responses here that aren't based on mythical assumptions of how the state can act, but a concrete experience of what authentically violence is in these societies. And I think that brings back the question of not just thinking about what it means for here, but what we experience here and what we've learned today for people concretely thinking about the problems of xenophobia and violence in places like the United Kingdom and the United States today. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Rahmane and Desmond. I've taken a whole lot of notes about things that I wanted to say, but I want to try and truncate them. They're not always important, and some of you mentioned already. But I think what I want to at least start off talking about is how we think about this as social scientists of one sort or another from these different places, from South Africa, from other countries in Africa, and from Latin American countries. And so, at the beginning, when I was introducing my part in the introduction, I talked about some of the concepts that have traveled and that we've used and explored and tested, and maybe then sort of new ones. So, for example, Desmond, in the work Violent Democracies in Latin America, uses the concept of violent pluralism. And that's clearly traveled quite well. I mean, it's been a big part of the discussion here. In my own reading of that, I wondered why violent democracy is prominent on the cover, but is not a concept in the, it's not explored as a concept. And I decided to work with that, to develop that as a concept. It's a kind of dialogue with the writing that is associated with. And it's quite striking that as far as I can recall, all the countries that we've talked about in this colloquium are, in one sense or another, at least putatively, democracies. And nonetheless, these kind of violent oppressions and violent struggles and contestations take place. So it seems to me that there's a kind of question about how democracy works in relation to these forces, as distinct from, our apartheid past, for example. And we're very aware here, and we sort of still very attached to the notion that democracy brought in a new era. So the question is, how do we think about what we've experienced in these 2 days, the things that we've kind of discussions, the kind of learnings that we've engaged ourselves in through comparing these different countries and the work of fellow social scientists. So one way to think about it is simply that, we came together, we talked, we listened to each other, we got new reflections on our own work, and we can go away enriched and rework some of our own work, deploying similar concepts or changing them somewhat, and so on. So that would be very fruitful, but in some senses it's a bit limited. Are there ways of actually deepening this and taking it further into some kind of ongoing collaboration, some kind of ongoing engagement that enables us to really test across global space, global land, global geography, how our research can speak to each other and inform each other. And I think that process has started today, but does it end today or not? So I'm struck here by, something that a number of us have remarked on is, wow, look at the similarities. There's these incredible kind of reverberations, resonances, similarities across our work. But when you dig a bit further, you find as much difference as similarity. So this identification of similarities can be misleading. So to give you an example, we heard this morning about the military occupation of the favelas in Rio. And the gunshots, and when we saw the video clip. Now the military has just moved, as other speakers have mentioned, have moved into Cape Flats Township as part of fighting crime, the idea of fighting crime there. You'll say, well, there's a great similarity there. The military's been deployed, in a sense, to pacify violence in neighborhoods of citizens. But the nature of that deployment, the nature of the military is very, very different. In our case, it's a kind of a performance of state power, but a muted one. There's an acceptance that the military are not going to engage in direct frontline attacks on violent entrepreneurs in those communities. Whereas in the favelas in Brazil, that's what's happening. That's the nature of what's happening there. So we've got to think further than the similarities into understanding the differences and what they mean. So here again, I mean, I know Brazil better than I know other countries in Latin America. I've been there a number of times, and I've read stuff about Brazil and Brazilian politics. And what really strikes me about Brazil is the deep historical confidence of the oligarchs and of the ruling families there. They were disturbed a bit by the PT regime, but they had no compunction when the balance of forces was right in moving against them, having a parliamentary coup and replacing them with, Temer, who was much more corrupt than PT people ever were. And that, it strikes me, is very different from the political situation in South Africa, where you've got a white elite, a white capitalist class that lost political power, and that in some respects feels its experience is one of losing political voice. Globalizing, they do various things, but there's a kind of modest sense of how they can engage with politics. And you've got a rising black elite whose domination is fragile, who depend on support from the masses. And this creates a very different political situation to the Brazilian one. I mean, we can't just mobilize a parliamentary coup here. It's not going to happen, not in the same way at all. So we need to understand these different historical trajectories, not only of the people, not only of the zones of exclusion, but also of elites, of the powers, of the military, and their relations to democracy. So I'm wondering, the extent to which we can build on the engagement here and take it further into a kind of deeper comparative work, exploring similarities and differences. I think Garth and I, convening this, we felt absolutely clear, or certainly as the project developed and as we saw the nature of the papers that were coming in, that there were publications in this, and that we really should mark this occasion by working on publications. But what kind of publications? Do we move into journal special issues? Do we look at a book? Is that a longer-term project? Those are some of the questions that we want to discuss afterwards. As we sort of recover from these 2 days and think through what the lessons might be, but also to have a discussion with Rahmane and Desmond about what they think. Get there to sort of basically pick their brains about what the possibilities are of using this moment for publication vis-a-vis a longer-term kind of collaboration, which might revolve around the sets of questions that are defined collectively and then explored in different ways in our different countries. So I think I want to really, there's comments here about the center-periphery, about the different geographies, about the kind of resonances between urban zones. What was quite striking in the panel this morning, the first panel, was the kind of urban zones of violent domination, and then the rural in Burkina Faso, where the state has limited reach and colludes with armed groups. So there's a lot of themes that we can take on. There's the one of histories, which Desmond has really stressed, and I think is really, really important. Deep, long histories, but also more immediate ones. Histories of violence and histories of state formation and so on. So I want to just leave it at that. So I think I've found it a tremendously interesting and fascinating engagement. I think there's, there's great loots that, being South African, we've got loots that we can make off with, intellectual loots that we take from this. But there's also the possibility, actually, of reinvesting it in an extended process of intellectual accumulation across the two continents as we try and deepen these projects and move forward with them. So that's what I wanted to say about it. Right, over to you.
So thanks, Rahmani, thanks, Desmond, thank you, Carl, for your reflections on the last 2.5 days. Before we go off, I do want to offer any of you as our guests, I don't think we're going to have a deliberative session at this point, but if there are any kind of burning comments from any of you before we close off, I really do want to keep a couple of minutes open. And so we'll take one over there.
I wasn't able to be here for the entire thing, but I have been here as much as I could be and have really appreciated all the inputs. Thank you. One thing that I was disappointed about was in your program, well, in the concept, you mention gender transgressive individuals as an important group who need to be considered, and I feel that I haven't heard transgender or intersex or gender non-conforming people and their issues and the violence that they face in all of the countries that we've spoken about explored at all, although every sort of violence pretty well that you mentioned does target them, as well as more random just being in the street. You sort of alluded to people who are marked by their difference. And occasionally we've sort of touched on gender, but I felt that a far richer and deeper analysis when we're looking at violence is really important.
Thanks. I mean, I think that's something that we're going to have to take on board as well. In part, you know, the way that the program was shaped was also partly determined by what people submitted, and so I think it is something that we're going to have to be mindful of, and how it is that we more deliberately engage with areas that are perhaps not always central to our own areas of immediate interest, but that speak very much to the kind of complexities of violence and the way that we deepen our thinking about that. So thank you for that. Any other comments from anybody as we close off? Yes.
Okay. Okay, just to perhaps, I would like to have seen, or at least a presentation about media, especially since the media have evolved. I remember in your introduction you mentioned the fourth industrial revolution. So in this age of fake news and social media, and how do we consume media as public, I think that's really imperative. Thank you.
Thanks. And again, I think that questions about violence and symbolic representation, representations in the media itself, whether, I was thinking a little bit about some of the presentations and the way that we use imagery, for example. And whether we need to be somewhat more critical of the way that we use imagery, because of course imagery is not simply a symbolic representation, it's also reproductive of particular ways of thinking about the world. And so I think the questions about how violence intersects with social media, but also in an era of mass communication. If I think about the work of people like Stuart Hall and so on, and really what this introduced into what we today know as cultural studies or cultural theory and so on, I think is going to be something really critical to look at again. And of course we have people who are interested in this area. And so this is, again, I mean, thank you for the input. I think it is something that we can certainly explore. Any other comments? Any other burning comments? All right, well, at this point I'm going to ask Carl to say a little final goodbye and a wrap up. Carl?
Yes, I mean, this is totally unexpected, and I feel incapable of almost any words at all. So, I mean, I really want to, well, it's a, I switched my machine off. So thanks for, in a way, reminding me. Yeah, Yara. So, I just want to say, apart from the thank yous that have already been said to those who made this possible, firstly, a big thank you to our participants from South Africa, but also from other countries who journeyed far. You know, for South Africans, they could move in and out of this, they could come, they could pick and choose, they came to one thing, they'd go away, and then they come back for another, maybe for the lunch. But our international guests have sat really through the whole thing and been tremendously persistent in doing that. And it's been really great having you. And you're fated to see us again, which is tomorrow when we do the Soweto tour, which we're looking forward to. We're going to have other kinds of conversations on the way. But we'll show you some of our great sites of liberation struggle, which have, you know, which preceded the period of our decline that we've been talking about over the last couple of days. But also thanks to everyone else. Those who came for the Feast of Ideas, the Feast of Experiences from elsewhere, those who came for the Feast of Lunch, and particularly the Feast of Teas. I mean, you know, I can't face the idea of another series of beautiful little sweet things that are, thank God I'm going home. So, everyone, just thanks for the discussion, thanks for the participation, and we'll keep on engaging. This is not a conversation that ends now. We'll be engaging over time, at least over the next 4 years while our money lasts. After that, it's anyone's guess whether we ever see any of you again. But yeah, thanks, enjoy a quiet evening, and we'll see some of you tomorrow.
Aman.